Hey guys, tonight we're traveling way back, like 4,000 years back, into the golden sands of ancient Egypt. The sun is high, the Nile is gliding past lazily, and you're sweating through your linen tunic while some priest eyes you suspiciously from under his intricately shaved brow. Welcome to the birthplace of structured time, where humans started organizing the chaos of sunrises and star cycles with tools made of stone, water, and imagination. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this heat. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you, hopefully bedtime. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the hot Egyptian sand, and the moment your foot lands outside the village wall, you realize something. You have absolutely no idea what time it is. No clocks. No phones. Not even a friendly rooster crowing in the distance. But in ancient Egypt, that didn't mean time didn't exist, it just looked a little dustier. The first timekeeping device you stumble across is laughably simple: a stick in the ground. Seriously, just a stick. But it's casting a very deliberate shadow across a flattened stretch of compacted sand. A man in a rough linen wrap watches it closely, occasionally shifting its angle with the practiced hands of someone who treats his shadows like we treat our watches. This is a shadow clock, essentially a sundial in its earliest, pretense-free form. Stick goes in the ground, sun moves across the sky, and the shadow follows it like an obedient dog. As basic as it sounds, this humble setup marked one of humanity's first real steps toward tracking time in a structured way. Mainstream historians agree that early Egyptians were among the first to build sundials intentionally, not just as religious markers but as practical tools for everyday scheduling. Farmers, priests, and bureaucrats all began orienting their lives around the movement of light and shadow. What's quirky here is how personal this all was. Some sundials were portable, essentially flat stone or wooden boards you could carry around like a primitive smartwatch. You can almost imagine someone tapping their hip and muttering, "Hold on, let me check my plank." But here's the kicker: this wasn't just a matter of knowing when to eat lunch. Time, in ancient Egypt, was sacred. It wasn't about convenience, it was about cosmic order. The sun god Ra was believed to ride his solar bark across the sky each day, dragging the sun behind him like some divine Uber. So the moving shadow wasn't just practical, it was theological. Watching the sun move meant tracking the very heartbeat of the universe. And, like any good system involving religion and bureaucracy, things got complicated fast. Different cities had different sundial designs. Some used obelisks, their sharp stone tips casting long shadows across specially carved pavements. Others relied on small stone slabs with etched hour lines. There wasn't exactly a universal standard, so if you traveled from Memphis to Thebes, you might have to recalibrate your mental clock, or just give up and pretend you meant to be late. Historians still argue whether these early shadow clocks were accurate down to the hour or more symbolic than practical. Some even suggest they were used as much for rituals as for scheduling actual tasks. Either way, they changed how humans moved through the day. Of course, none of this worked at night, or on cloudy days, or say, during a sandstorm, which Egypt had plenty of. So people had to get creative. That creativity would blossom into water clocks, star charts, and mythological cowbellies full of stars. But for now, you're stuck here beside a stick, watching a shadow slowly crawl across the sand, knowing that this is where it all began. Someone offers you a small fig to chew on while you wait. You accept, gratefully. The sun blazes. The air buzzes with the lazy hum of locusts. And the shadow moves, slowly, precisely, like a whisper across the centuries. The shadow has moved. Not by much, but enough that the man beside you adjusts the stick's angle, mutters something about the third hour, and gathers his tools. Time, apparently, has shifted, and it's your cue to follow him into the heart of town, where the real stars of ancient Egyptian time-keeping tower above everything else. You round a corner and suddenly feel small, really small. Looming above you is an obelisk, a massive stone needle pointing to the heavens, its surface carved with lines of hieroglyphs and its tip glinting faintly in the sun. The air cools just slightly in its shadow, which stretches long and deliberate across a carefully measured square of white limestone. This, it turns out, is not just a monument. It's a gigantic sundial, a public timekeeper that doubles as a tribute to the gods and a status symbol for the pharaoh who paid for it. The obelisk's shadow cuts across engraved lines on the plaza, like the hand of a cosmic clock ticking away the day. And this isn't a casual glance at your wrist situation. Oh no. These shadow rituals are serious business. The priests here track the obelisk's shadow obsessively. When the shadow hits a certain point on the stone floor, it's time to begin morning offerings. A little farther, and it's the hour of temple cleansing. When the shadow aligns with the western edge, everyone in the complex knows it's time to prepare the mid-afternoon incense. No reminders necessary. Mainstream historical accounts confirm that many large temples used obelisks this way. They weren't just decorative, they were celestial precision instruments designed to align religious routines with the movement of the sun. For a society that believed in the sacred order of Ma'at, balance, harmony, timing, getting these rituals right wasn't optional. It was spiritual maintenance. Now here's the quirky twist. This very same shadow was also used to decide mundane things, like when workers could break for lunch or when scribes should switch duties. Imagine someone peering out at the shadow and muttering, "Ah, the 5th hour. Time for figs and barley again. Sacred timing, and snack time." And still, historians argue whether all of these time divisions were consistent across Egypt. Some regions broke the day into 12 parts, others into 24, some with hours that flexed depending on the season. Yes, you heard that right. The length of an hour actually changed depending on whether it was summer or winter. Winter hours. Short and snappy. Summer hours. Long and languid like the Nile itself. It gets even more confusing if you try to compare their hours to ours. Your 2 p.m. might have been their 7th hour one day, and their 6th the next week. Imagine trying to schedule a doctor's appointment in that system. Come back at the 9th hour. Which 9th hour? Tuesdays or the equinoxes? But somehow, they made it work. The sun moved, the shadows stretched, and life ticked along in a grand, slightly wobbly rhythm. You watch a group of workers glance at the obelisk and then calmly lay down their tools. Shadow says break time. No arguments. One of them hands you a small cup of something cool, fermented barley water, slightly fizzy and vaguely sour. The 8th hour drink, he says with a wink. You sip. It tastes like time well spent. As you rest beneath the obelisk's long shadow, a young girl sketches hour lines in the dust with a reed. She's trying to replicate the stone pattern in miniature, copying the sacred geometry like it's a puzzle. One day, she'll likely be a temple scribe or maybe even a timekeeper herself. Because here's the heart of it. In ancient Egypt, time was not just measured, it was respected, even loved. People didn't just glance at clocks, they interacted with time physically, spiritually, and communally. Time was part of the landscape, part of the architecture, part of the story. And as the sun begins to dip lower in the sky, the shadow elongates, bending toward the edge of the plaza like it's reaching for something just out of sight. You get the sense it's been doing this same stretch, this same reach, for centuries. Millennia, even. The obelisk doesn't move. But time does. You rise, brushing dust from your robe. The girl waves as you leave, her reed tracing more invisible hours into the soil. Her sundial might not survive the next breeze, but the impulse behind it, the need to measure, to align, to make sense of this strange passage we call a day, that part is timeless. You step away from the obelisk's long shadow, winding down a shaded alley between mud brick walls. The heat softens as you enter a temple courtyard, quiet except for the flutter of ibis wings and the occasional creak of an ancient wooden door. Here, in this serene, almost monastic place, time doesn't pass, it drips. Literally. Welcome to the age of clepsydras, or water clocks. No more relying on moody shadows or clouds that ruin your sundial selfie. Here, time flows predictably from one vessel to another, one droplet at a time. You spot it almost immediately. a round, polished stone basin perched on a pedestal, with a small hole at its base. Inside, water slowly trickles out in a steady stream, collecting in a second basin below. The top bowl is marked with faint, etched lines along its inner wall, hour markers. Each time the water level dips below one line, a new hour has passed. It's deeply peaceful to watch, almost hypnotic. You find yourself leaning in, just to hear the quiet rhythm of time escaping. Plip, plop, plip. Mainstream scholars agree that Egyptian water clocks were among the earliest to be used for nighttime measurements, especially inside temples where natural light didn't reach. The dripping allowed priests to maintain precise ritual timings even when Ra had clocked out for the evening. And this was crucial. Rituals had to occur at exact times. Not roughly after sunset, but the fourth hour of night, give or take a few drips. Priests would set these clocks in the early evening, noting where the water started and monitoring it carefully all night, sometimes trading off shifts like timekeeping lifeguards. But let's pause here for something deliciously obscure. Some fringe researchers argue that certain Egyptian water clocks weren't just bowls, they were ornately sculpted lions, baboons, or even baboon-headed gods. One theory claims a water clock shaped like Thoth, the god of wisdom, existed, his outstretched hands collecting the trickling water like some divine barista counting espresso shots. Historians still debate whether clepsydras were widely used outside temples. Some say they were reserved only for the elite or for ceremonial use, while others suggest even rural communities had simple versions using clay pots and etched sticks. After all, you don't need to be a high priest to care when your bread's done baking or when your kids have studied enough hieroglyphs for the day. A young temple apprentice shuffles past you, yawning. She carries a small copper ladle and pours fresh water into the top bowl. As the droplets begin again, she turns to you and mutters something about resetting Ra's teacup. And just like that, you're thinking, this is time as a liquid. Time you can see, taste, refill. It's oddly comforting to imagine your day measured in tiny sips instead of shrill alarms or blinking red numbers. No rush. Just water, moving downward, always in motion. You sit near the edge of the stone platform and close your eyes. The smell of incense still lingers, spicy and sweet, with a hint of old papyrus and damp stone. Somewhere nearby, a reed flute plays a soft melody. One of the temple guards is probably bored again. You picture priests in white linen, pacing by the clepsydra, watching the water, waiting for that next hour line to emerge. It's a kind of devotion, not to a god, but to the rhythm of existence itself. A spiritual practice disguised as punctuality. Of course, the system wasn't perfect. Evaporation played tricks. Water pressure shifted. And if your vessel was tilted even slightly, your hour could be 20 minutes long or 95. Still, for their time, the Egyptians achieved remarkable accuracy, especially compared to, say, sundials during a sandstorm. One particularly fascinating example, spotted in the Karnak temple, was shaped like a tall cone with 12 lines carved inside, representing 12 night hours. As the water descended, it passed each hour mark at regular intervals. Scientists who reconstructed these clocks found they were startlingly precise, unless someone forgot to refill them. Oops. That's the thing about water clocks. They're reliable, but needy. Like a cactus that gets fussy if you forget its birthday. Before long, the apprentice returns to check the water level. She squints, notes the fourth mark submerged, and disappears through a stone archway, probably to signal the next phase of a nighttime rite. The temple's heartbeat continues, drip by sacred drip. You watch as another droplet falls, rippling the collected pool below. You lean in, feeling the coolness rising from the basin, the faint scent of copper and minerals in the water. Time here is tactile. You don't just observe it, you feel it, hear it, maybe even dream it. And maybe that's the true gift of this ancient clock, not precision, but presence. The night fades slowly, and you emerge from the temple courtyard just as a peach-colored glow rises on the eastern horizon. The cool air hums with anticipation. Temple servants are already bustling, water jugs sloshing, sandals whispering against sandstone. You trail behind them, past rows of painted pillars, and step into a grand hall where the rules of time stretch beyond the physical. Welcome to the realm of ritual timekeeping, where clocks are sacred, calendars are cosmic, and being on time means aligning your soul with the heavens. Inside, the priests are already deep into the choreography of dawn, lighting incense, chanting in low, rhythmic tones, and moving in perfect synchrony like dancers following some invisible beat. But that beat, it's not just set by sundials or dripping clepsydras. It's embedded in their rituals, their myths, their entire worldview. To the ancient Egyptians, time wasn't a straight line, it was cyclical. Every day mirrored the original day of creation. Every sunrise was Ra being reborn, rowing his solar bark across the sky. Every dusk, he descended into the underworld, battling chaos before rising again. Time was cosmic recycling, not forward momentum. That means every ritual, whether it's an offering of lotus flowers or a chant to Horus, was not just symbolic. It was functional. You weren't reenacting a story, you were rebooting the universe. Mainstream historians agree that ritual schedules were tightly tied to cosmology. Specific ceremonies happened at fixed times each day, month, or season, meant to maintain Marat, the divine balance. The most powerful among these were sunrise rituals, often held on temple rooftops, facing east. But here's where things get quirky. Some temple complexes had star clocks painted inside tombs or on ceilings, charts that used star positions to mark time during the night. Certain stars, like Sirius, were so important that their appearance could trigger not only festivals but changes in civil policy and tax collection schedules. Historians still debate how widespread star clocks were. Some believe they were elite tools used only by high priests and royal astronomers. Others suggest they informed daily schedules for farmers and merchants, especially when lunar and solar calendars clashed. Which, spoiler alert, happened constantly. You pause beneath a mural of Nut, the sky goddess, her arched body dotted with stars. A priest gestures upward with a copper pointer, tracing imaginary lines between star glyphs while muttering counts under his breath. He's measuring the decans, groups of stars that rise in sequence throughout the night, like celestial stepping stones. Each group marks about 40 minutes. A dreamy, slow-paced night shift timer, if you will. Someone taps your shoulder and hands you a thin strip of palm reed. It's inscribed with a sequence of tasks, each aligned with a sacred hour. You read, 3rd hour, cleanse statue feet. 4th hour, offer pomegranate wine. 5th hour, recite hymn 17 to Ra, refrain from sneezing. You blink. Refrain from sneezing? The man shrugs. Very disruptive to cosmic harmony. You can't argue with that. You follow the group deeper into the temple, watching how seamlessly these people blend practicality with celestial ritual. Time is layered, there's the ticking of the water clock, yes, but also a spiritual clock, set to rhythms bigger than any human system. People know what to do, not because someone shouts a command, but because the light hits a column at a certain angle or a chant echoes at just the right pitch. It's all deeply meditative. No meetings. No phone alarms. Just daily life performed as a sacred offering, syncing with gods and stars like a cosmic jazz band. Of course, this type of timekeeping wasn't without its headaches. The Egyptians used a civil calendar based on 365 days, a neat 12 months of 30 days, plus 5 festival days at the end. But this didn't align with the actual solar year, which is about 365.25 days. Over time, festivals and seasons drifted, leading to awkward situations like celebrating the harvest festival during, well, 0 harvests. To compensate, they relied on star risings, especially that of Sirius, known as Sopdet, whose appearance in the sky heralded the flooding of the Nile. This heliacal rising became an unofficial reset button for the calendar, reminding everyone that while humans liked tidy numbers, the cosmos preferred fluidity. You settle beside a wall niche lined with stone benches. Another priest sits beside you, chewing on dried dates and humming a hymn under his breath. You ask about the 9th hour. He doesn't answer with a number. He simply points to a shaft of sunlight inching its way across the floor, toward the center of a lotus mosaic. When that petal lights up, he says, we turn the statues to face west. And you realize, Clocks don't always tick. Sometimes they glow. You're still thinking about that glowing lotus petal as you follow the priests out of the temple and into the busy outer courtyards. Morning has fully arrived now. The sky is bright but still soft, tinged with the pale gold that only lingers for a few precious minutes before the real heat descends. You wipe a bit of dust from your sandal and glance around. Vendors are setting up baskets of lentils, onions, and oddly perfect melons. Donkeys yawn, chickens shuffle, and everyone seems to be doing exactly what they're supposed to, right when they're supposed to. Coincidence? Not exactly. You're now in the world of agricultural timekeeping, how the ancient Egyptians used nature's rhythms to run the show. Because in a land with one season called inundation, another called growth, and the last named simply harvest, you better believe time was serious business. Mainstream scholars agree that the ancient Egyptian year was divided into 3 distinct seasons based on the behavior of the Nile: Ake, flooding; Parait, growth; and Shimu, harvest. These seasons governed everything from planting schedules to tax collection. If you didn't know what season it was, you might miss your chance to sow barley, or worse, miss your appointment with the tax scribe. And no one enjoys a surprise tax scribe. Each season lasted 4 months of 30 days. That sounds charmingly organized, until you remember that the Nile doesn't exactly own a wristwatch. Some years it flooded early, some years late, some years not at all. So how did farmers keep track? That's where the sky and the soil stepped in. Farmers looked to rising constellations, bird migrations, changes in lotus bloom cycles, and even the behavior of crocodiles. One old tale, likely apocryphal but fun, says that if the crocodiles stopped sunbathing 2 days early, a late flood was coming. Did it work? Historians still debate whether this was folklore or a remarkably accurate early version of storm tracking. You wander over to a wide field dotted with men in knee-length kilts and wide straw hats. They're examining a narrow irrigation canal, its water still trickling from the last flood. Nearby, a tall stick topped with a crossbar and plumbline, the merkit, one of Egypt's early surveying tools, stands half buried in the silt. A man sees you staring and waves you over. This, he says, pointing to the merkit, is how we find straight lines for planting. And the gods love straight lines. You ask if it's a clock. He laughs. No, no. It's older than clocks. But also, kind of a clock. Everything's a clock if you're paying attention. And honestly, he has a point. Because even though the merkit was mostly used for surveying and architecture, it also helped align temples and tombs with the stars. It relied on a plumbline and a fixed star, usually in the constellation we now call Ursa Major. Once aligned, you could establish due north and build your granary, shrine, or backyard cucumber trellis accordingly. You sit down on a flat rock near the canal, watching farmers sprinkle something into the soil. It smells herbal, maybe dried fenugreek? A young boy carries a small bowl and tosses its contents rhythmically into furrows. You realize he's counting steps in his head, dropping seeds every 5th one. There's no water clock here. No sundial. No priest. Just rhythm. Repetition. Generational timing passed down through seasons, not seconds. Of course, there were actual tools too. Some farmers used nilometers, carved stone staircases along the river that marked flood levels. The higher the water climbed, the better the taxes and the crop yields. Low floods meant trouble. Too high. Also trouble. Like Goldilocks, the Nile had to be just right. One nilometer near Aswan still exists, its stone steps smoothed from centuries of bare feet. Priests used to announce flood measurements in public, adding a nice bit of drama to the weather report. Imagine someone ringing a gong and shouting, "The river has reached the 22nd step. Prepare the barley." There's even some fringe debate that farmers used their own form of shadow sticks, small vertical poles that help them judge time based on the sun's angle over their plots. Whether or not that's true, one thing's certain: they didn't need an app to remind them when to water the beans. You rest your head back against the rock, letting the sun warm your face. A heron glides overhead, its wings slicing the air in slow, deliberate strokes. Somewhere nearby, a goat sneezes. Even in this gentle chaos, there's a schedule. An unspoken clock ticking forward, not with hands, but with footfalls, feathers, shadows, and seeds. You start to think, maybe the most reliable clocks don't sit in temples or drip water in stone bowls. Maybe they roam in flocks, grow in rows, and bloom at dawn. The air shifts as midday approaches. The golden warmth that felt gentle on your skin is now edging toward, I may be roasting like a ceremonial duck. You shield your eyes and head toward a shaded workshop, where the sound of soft metal tapping mingles with the coo of pigeons. Inside, craftsmen crouch around strange bronze contraptions, slightly bowl-shaped, lined with faint markings, and carefully polished until they reflect the room's dim light. At last, you've arrived at the beating heart of this sleepy history, the Egyptian water clock, or clepsydra. Now, before you panic, no, this isn't a quiz. No equations. No pop quiz on ancient hydraulics. This is ancient Egypt's answer to the question, how can I tell time when the sun is absolutely useless? Because remember, while sundials are great, they don't work at night, indoors, or during dust storms, which, in Egypt, were just another Tuesday. So clever Egyptian inventors turned to water, predictable, steady, and impossible to argue with. Unless, of course, you're trying to measure time in a leaky bowl. Mainstream historians agree that the earliest clepsydras appeared in Egypt by the 16th century BCE, during the reign of Amenhotep III. These weren't your average household items. They were usually made of stone or bronze, with a small hole in the bottom that let water drip out at a controlled rate. Inside the bowl, hours were marked by lines, usually 12 per side, adjusting seasonally since night hours changed length depending on the time of year. Yes, you heard that right. Night wasn't always the same number of hours. The Egyptians used temporal hours, which meant that night was divided into 12 parts, regardless of how long it actually lasted. In winter, those hours were long and luxurious. In summer, they were quick and snappy. It's like time was a stretchable fabric. Some days it was a cozy sweater, others a cropped tank top. Historians still argue whether this meant multiple clepsydras were required throughout the year, or if the priests just used charts to interpret the lines differently as seasons changed. Either way, it wasn't exactly set it and forget it. Being an ancient Egyptian timekeeper required both math skills and an intuitive sense of moonlight. You crouch beside an old priest inspecting a fresh clepsydra. He squints at the internal lines, then mutters something about uneven drip rate. You assume this is bad. He points to a pile of discarded bowls, some cracked, others with holes drilled slightly off-center. Too fast, he says, holding one up. This one finished the night in 8 hours. Too slow, he points to another. This one lasted past sunrise. Very embarrassing. Chickens crowed before we were done chanting. It's oddly comforting to realize that even in 1400 BCE, people still had timing problems. You watch as they test another bowl by filling it with water from a tall ceramic jug. The room goes quiet, save for the soft plink, plink, plink of water droplets escaping through the bottom. The drip is hypnotic, slow, rhythmic, dependable. One man times the drip by counting heartbeats. Another sketches adjustments on a piece of papyrus. A third adjusts the bowl's position with the solemnity of a modern techie tweaking the brightness on their third monitor. Then there's a fringe idea you hear whispered in a side conversation. Some scholars believe certain water clocks were actually inflow clepsydras, where water entered the vessel instead of dripping out. These might have had a floating pointer, slowly rising to indicate the hour. It's not a widely accepted theory, but it does tickle the imagination. A reverse drip clock? Very avant-garde. Of course, water's not perfect. Evaporation was a constant headache. Humidity could change the flow. And let's not even talk about the occasional frog who mistook the clepsydra for a stylish bird bath. You move to a corner where one priest has lovingly inscribed a bowl with hieroglyphs, tiny symbols for stars, hours, gods, and poetic invocations. It's not just a tool, it's a prayer you can pour. You pick it up. It's heavier than it looks. As you tilt it, water traces the etched lines like a miniature Nile. And just for a moment, it's easy to forget how long you've been here. In this dim room, with bronze and stone and the never-ending plink of time leaking away. You're as close as you'll ever be to holding a moment in your hands. Then someone sneezes. Again. You glance up. The same temple apprentice from earlier grins sheepishly and offers a half-apologetic shrug. Well, that's time for you. Fluid, sacred, and forever susceptible to interruptions from poorly timed pollen. The rhythmic plink of the clepsydra fades into the background as you find yourself drawn to the bustling marketplace just beyond the workshop. The air is thick with the scent of roasting meat and freshly baked bread, a far cry from the quiet of the temple. The rhythm of daily life continues here, much like it has for thousands of years, an endless loop of trade, barter, and quiet gossip. And yet, there's something oddly mesmerizing about how time, in this space, feels both solid and ephemeral at the same time. You glance around and notice the soft glow of the sun beginning to shift, casting long shadows over the stone walls. The time of day is starting to settle into that familiar late afternoon haze, the kind that always makes you feel like you have all the time in the world, even as the sun slips lower and lower. But if you ask the ancient Egyptians, they'd tell you that time was never meant to be wasted. At least, not in the way we think about it today. This is where the Egyptians' obsession with precision in their timekeeping truly takes shape. Yes, they had water clocks, sundials, and celestial tools, but they also had a deep cultural understanding of the importance of marking time down to the smallest details. And perhaps the most striking example of this, in the ancient world, was the development of the temporal hour, a unit of time unlike any we're familiar with today. You can almost hear the priests' voices drifting back from the temple as they chant the hours of the day, each one neatly boxed in between the walls of tradition. The temporal hour was not based on the consistent passage of time, like we measure it with our modern clocks, but on the length of the daylight and the night. In essence, each hour of the day was equal, but the length of each hour varied depending on the season. In summer, when daylight stretched long and the Nile overflowed with the promise of a bountiful harvest, each hour would feel like a luxurious stretch of time, perfect for sitting in the shade, reflecting on the gods, and observing the slow, deliberate rise of the sun. But in winter, when the days were short and the Nile receded, those same hours would pass in the blink of an eye, a fleeting moment of sunlight before the inevitable return of night. It's difficult to imagine living in a world where time was elastic, where the passage of a single hour could feel completely different depending on the season, the angle of the sun, and the swell of the Nile. But for the Egyptians, this was a way of life. The more you think about it, the more you realize that the Egyptians weren't so much measuring time as they were tracking its pulse, catching fleeting moments before they slipped away forever. Time wasn't just about numbers and rigid hours, it was about a relationship with nature, a delicate dance between humans and the cosmic forces that govern the universe. As you wander through the market, you see more examples of this intricate time awareness. Vendors are arranging their goods with a careful eye, making sure that they're ready for the change of the day. As the sun lowers, certain herbs and spices will become more valuable. Potions for sleep, aphrodisiacs, and charms to ward off evil spirits. You pause in front of a stall where an old woman is carefully weighing dried herbs. Her scales, crafted from dark wood, look as though they could have come from 1,000 years ago, yet there's something about them that feels timeless. You ask her what she's doing, and she gives you a toothless grin before murmuring something about the hour of the cat. A moment, she says, when the herbs are most potent. This, it seems, is another layer of Egyptian time, ritual and magic interwoven with the tick-tock of the hours. Time wasn't simply measured on a clock but felt in the flow of the day, in the rustling of leaves, the sound of water splashing in a nearby basin, and even the subtle movement of the stars above. To the Egyptians, the idea of time was far more fluid, mystical, and connected to the world around them than the rigid, machine-driven time we rely on today. But not everyone shared this view. In fact, some early scholars of Egyptian history believed that the Egyptians were entirely bound by a belief in eternal cycles, unable to understand the linear progression of time we take for granted today. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians saw their timekeeping as a means of measurement at all, or simply as a way to sync their lives with the rhythms of the earth. As you slip into a nearby alley to escape the increasing heat, you start to feel the weight of time pulling at you. Maybe it's the sun, the food, or the stories that linger in the air. But time, here, feels softer. You close your eyes for just a second, imagining what it would be like to live in a world where time wasn't something you simply watched pass, but something you lived with, something that ebbed and flowed like the waters of the Nile itself. And when you open your eyes again, you see a young boy with a small basket of figs, carefully counting each one as he places them on the merchant's stand. 1, 2, 3, 4. The precise number of figs he needs to complete the sale. For him, time is still something to be measured, managed, and accounted for. But for the Egyptians, it was also something that wove its way through their lives like a quiet, ever-flowing river, always shifting, always present, but never really rushing. The marketplace hums behind you as you walk further into the city, past the rows of vendors selling linen, perfumes, and pottery. The warm evening light filters through the palm trees, casting long shadows on the cobbled streets, and the air smells faintly of incense and roasted meat. The city, though constantly moving, has a rhythm to it, one that feels ancient, yet still very much alive. As you wander through the labyrinth of narrow streets, you find yourself drawn toward the massive stone structures rising up on the horizon. The temple, its towering columns, carved with symbols of gods and pharaohs, calls you. Inside, the priests are preparing for the evening rituals, a practice that has remained largely unchanged for centuries. Here, time is not measured with water clocks or sundials, but through sacred ceremonies, offerings, and chants that echo through the ages. It's within the walls of these temples that you begin to understand just how deeply time and the gods were intertwined in the Egyptian worldview. To the ancient Egyptians, time wasn't just a human construct. It was an extension of the divine order, a cosmic rhythm that governed not only the cycles of the day and night but also the very ebb and flow of the Nile, the changing seasons, and the life cycle itself. You enter the temple, and the coolness of the stone welcomes you. The air is thick with incense, and the sound of chanting fills your ears. The priests, dressed in simple linen garments, move in slow, deliberate motions. Their faces are solemn, focused on their task as they prepare offerings of food and drink to the gods. You watch as they measure the time between each offering, counting the seconds with a precision that seems to transcend human understanding. But then, you notice something unusual, a small wooden box on a pedestal, its surface worn and weathered by centuries of use. It's a timekeeping device, one that, at first glance, doesn't seem like much. Yet, upon closer inspection, you see that it holds a deep significance. This box, known as the shadow clock, is a remarkable innovation that allows the priests to measure time not with water, but with the sun itself. This simple contraption consists of a small wooden board with a pointed stick, called a gnomon, stuck through the center. The shadow of the gnomon moves across the board as the sun moves through the sky, marking the passing of time in a way that's far more precise than the crude water clocks used in daily life. The shadow clock, though a humble device, was revolutionary for its ability to track the time of day in an accurate and repeatable way, no matter the season or the whims of the river. Historians still argue whether the shadow clock was primarily used for religious rituals or more practical purposes, such as tracking the hours for labor. Some scholars believe it was a device reserved strictly for the temples, while others contend that it was widely used in everyday life, especially among those who needed to manage their time according to the demands of farming, trade, or construction. But regardless of its precise purpose, the shadow clock is a reminder that time in ancient Egypt was always in flux, always shifting. Even the gods themselves had to adhere to a kind of cosmic schedule, one dictated by the sun, the stars, and the moon. In this sense, time was both a gift and a burden, something that could never be escaped, only carefully measured and understood. The priests used the shadow clock as part of their rituals, adjusting their offerings and prayers to match the passing hours. You watch as they move in synchrony with the clock, a sacred dance of devotion to the gods. Time is more than just a tool here. It's a way of connecting with the divine, a way of aligning oneself with the universe. As you leave the temple, the evening is fully upon you. The last rays of the sun are fading, and the air has grown cooler. The streets are quieter now, but the city's rhythm continues, undisturbed by the passage of time. You can hear the distant call of a donkey, the murmur of voices from nearby homes, and the soft rustle of palm leaves in the breeze. Time, in Egypt, is not something to be feared or avoided, it's something to be embraced, something to be understood. You can't help but think of how differently time is treated in the modern world. We're surrounded by clocks and calendars, always rushing to meet deadlines, to move from one task to the next. But in ancient Egypt, time was measured in the movements of the heavens, in the cycles of nature, in the rhythm of the river. It was slow, deliberate, and in some ways, infinitely more present than the time we know today. For a moment, as you watch the stars begin to appear overhead, you wonder what it would be like to live in a world where time was not something that chased you, but something you moved with, a quiet, sacred companion, as old and constant as the earth beneath your feet. As the first stars twinkle overhead, you breathe deeply, feeling the peace of this ancient world settle around you. Time, it seems, is not something you can master, but something you must learn to live in harmony with. And perhaps, just for tonight, you're ready to let go of your own frantic race against the clock. You walk back into the streets, the cool night air now wrapping around you like a soft blanket. The city of ancient Egypt seems to breathe in rhythm with the stars above, and there's a subtle sense that everything, every movement, every sound, every person, is part of a grand, infinite pattern. There's no rush here. The world feels more like a slow dance than a race, and you can't help but wonder how much of it comes from the people's relationship with time. As you continue your stroll, you pass a group of workers who are already starting to set up for the next day. In a place where time is marked by the celestial rhythms, their work still seems endless, an unbroken cycle of labor, rest, and ritual. These people are not using water clocks or shadow clocks to measure their time. They're measuring it by the rise and fall of the Nile, by the changing seasons, and the consistent call of birds in the morning. For them, time is as much a part of their environment as the sand underfoot. You stop near a large building that you recognize as one of the temples dedicated to the god Ra, the sun god. The Egyptians believed Ra's passage across the sky governed not only their hours but their very lives. From the moment Ra rose in the east to when he set in the west, everything that happened in between, the ebb of the Nile, the growth of crops, the success of the pharaoh, was determined by his movements. Inside the temple, you see a priest marking time on a sundial, another of the Egyptians' sophisticated timekeeping devices. While the shadow clock relied on the angle of the sun to mark time during daylight hours, the sundial, a later development, offered a more precise method. With the sundial, Egyptians were able to divide the day into segments that were not merely approximate but measured with great care. But unlike the mechanical clocks of later civilizations, the sundial still relied on natural forces, the position of the sun, the changing angle of light, something far less predictable than the rigid structure of hours and minutes we're familiar with today. The sundial would track the time of day, yes, but also mark the moments when everything would pause, a time for reflection, for prayer, for offerings. As you stand at the temple entrance, you can almost feel the weight of time pressing down on you. You're part of something larger, something that stretches back thousands of years, where people were not afraid of time but saw it as a guiding force, something to be understood, respected, and lived in harmony with. In the silence of the temple, the air feels thick with the presence of the gods. For the ancient Egyptians, time was not just an earthly measurement, but a divine mandate. Every action had its moment. Every event was set to a rhythm. And as the stars begin to twinkle in the darkening sky, you feel that connection, too, between you, the ancient Egyptians, and the eternal cosmic cycle that governs us all. Historians still debate the origins of Egypt's sundial. While the Greeks are often credited with its invention, there is evidence to suggest the Egyptians were using it long before. Some scholars believe the sundial's development in Egypt predates any similar device in ancient Greece, though concrete evidence is elusive. Regardless of who invented it, the sundial, like the shadow clock, serves as a reminder of how intertwined time was with their religious and daily life. The sun is now gone, leaving the sky to stretch out in a blanket of stars. The night feels infinitely larger here than back home, the vastness of the universe stretching out in every direction. You find yourself walking toward the river again, following the same path the Egyptians walked as they worked the land, as they celebrated festivals, as they measured the passing of seasons. In a quiet corner of the riverbank, you pause to watch the reflection of the stars in the water, and for a brief moment, it feels like time has stood still. Perhaps it's the rhythmic nature of this place that lulls you into a sense of peace, or perhaps it's the deep connection to the natural world, the knowledge that time here is not a race but a cycle, slow and deliberate. The soft, rhythmic sounds of the water lapping against the shore become almost hypnotic, and you close your eyes, feeling your body relax. In this moment, you understand what the Egyptians knew so many centuries ago. That time is not something you control, but something you flow with. It's a gentle reminder that we, too, can learn to sync our lives to the natural rhythms around us, slowing down to match the unhurried pace of the universe. The river, now calm and steady, holds your attention. The gentle ripples on its surface reflect the moonlight, which seems to dance with the breeze. As you watch, you feel a sense of timelessness wash over you, like the water itself is carrying you away to a place where hours and minutes are less important than the flow of life. The Nile, the lifeblood of Egypt, has always been a force of nature, a constant in a world of change. You realize that for all the ways the ancient Egyptians measured time, it was the river, with its regular floods and receding waters, that was the true keeper of time. It marked the seasons, signaled the right moments for planting, harvesting, and even celebrating. For them, the river was not only a source of life, but a clock in its own right. As you stand there, lost in the rhythm of the night, you recall something you'd read earlier, a quirky fact that seems almost magical in its simplicity. The Egyptians, it turns out, also had a form of calendar. Not a linear one, as we use today, but one based on the cycles of the moon and the stars. The lunar calendar they used had 12 months, each based on the moon's phases, with each month divided into 3 weeks, totaling 36 weeks in a year. This division of time was far more flexible than our modern days, making it easier for the Egyptians to adjust to the ever-changing nature of the Nile and the heavens. Historians still debate the accuracy of the Egyptian calendar. Many believe it was used primarily for religious purposes, while others argue it was also central to agricultural life. Was it the moon that dictated the rituals performed in honor of the gods, or the ebb and flow of the Nile that governed their daily life? The answer may never be entirely clear, but the calendar was, without a doubt, a reflection of the rhythmic balance that the Egyptians sought in all things. But even as the calendar helped them track the important dates and events, there was something even more significant happening. The Egyptians, it seems, never really saw time as something to conquer. They lived in harmony with it. Time wasn't segmented into rigid hours or minutes. Instead, it was fluid, aligned with the natural world, where every moment seemed to be just as important as the one before it. You notice that the moon, now high in the sky, seems to cast everything in a soft glow, just enough to illuminate the beauty of the riverbank and the subtle flow of the water. The world around you feels at peace, and for a brief moment, you can almost hear the echoes of ancient Egyptians who might have stood right here, on the same riverbank, watching the same moon. Their rhythms, too, were gentle. The moments of work, of reflection, of worship, each were part of an eternal cycle. Time wasn't something to race against, but something to live with, something that provided the framework for everything to unfold. You realize that the Egyptians had a profound understanding of the cosmic nature of time, a concept far removed from our hurried modern world, where we rush through our days, trying to fit more into every fleeting minute. You begin to imagine how they might have spent their evenings, standing just where you are, gazing at the same sky and listening to the water. Perhaps they would have spoken softly to each other, contemplating the gods, or simply allowing the peacefulness of the night to wash over them. Life was not a race in ancient Egypt, and for the Egyptians themselves, the passage of time was a quiet, steady presence in the background of their daily lives. As the stars begin to twinkle more brightly above you, you let yourself rest in the stillness. The ancient Egyptians knew the power of slowing down. They didn't let time control them. Instead, they moved in rhythm with it, attuned to the natural forces around them. You imagine that, perhaps, if you could learn to live like that, like the Egyptians, attuned to the world's natural rhythms, you might find a little more peace in your own life. No rush, no hurry, just the gentle unfolding of time as it is meant to be. The moon is now at its highest point in the sky, and the river continues its quiet flow. There's a sense of finality to the night, a gentle reminder that the day is over, and the stars will soon give way to the dawn. But for now, you're content. Content in the timelessness of it all. You walk along the river's edge, allowing the serenity to sink in. It's a reminder that time is not the ticking clock we often think it is. It is not about the minutes or the hours. It is about moments. About breathing in the air, feeling the water, and listening to the world around you. Perhaps, just for tonight, that's all you need to know. As you continue walking along the river, your mind wanders back to the grand cities of Egypt, the impressive temples and monumental structures that line the banks. But as the night stretches on, you find yourself wondering, what of the people who weren't involved in the construction of such grand edifices? What about the ordinary folk whose lives were equally bound by the rhythms of time, but in far more subtle ways? It's easy to imagine the pharaohs and priests, the scribes and architects, all playing their roles in the creation of Egypt's majestic landmarks. But for the common people, those who lived far from the temple gates and royal courts, time moved differently. Their connection to time wasn't just ceremonial, it was practical, measured by the necessities of daily life. And yet, in this ever-changing world, they too had their ways of marking the passing of time. As you stand there on the riverbank, a distant memory resurfaces from earlier studies, the thought of the Egyptian work calendar. Unlike the lunar system that marked the flow of the seasons, this calendar was more straightforward, reflecting the agricultural nature of Egypt itself. The year was divided into 3 seasons, each corresponding to a critical phase in the agricultural cycle: inundation, emergence, and harvest. It was a simple system, but one that governed the entire rhythm of life, not just for the priests and nobility, but for the laborers, farmers, and everyone who relied on the Nile for sustenance. In inundation, the flooding of the Nile would bring water and nutrients to the soil, preparing the land for planting. It was a time of rest for many, a time when the fields lay dormant, and farmers would focus on tasks like repairing tools and building homes. Historians argue that this was the quiet season, when the whole of Egypt seemed to pause, preparing for the next phase of the agricultural cycle. Some scholars still debate whether the inundation season was actually a time of religious festivals, where the gods were honored for the fertility they bestowed on the land. But what's clear is that this was the moment when the Egyptians connected most directly with nature's cycle. The emergence season, which followed, was a time of planting. As the waters of the Nile receded, the farmers would rush to sow their crops, making the most of the fertile soil left behind. This was when the everyday life of Egypt truly began to mirror the rhythms of nature. The rise of the sun was no longer merely symbolic, it was a daily event that dictated the workday. Even though the Egyptians didn't have the same strict timekeeping methods we do today, they followed the natural indicators, with the sun rising to announce the start of work and setting to signal the end. By the time harvest arrived, the labor of the previous months had paid off. Crops were gathered, and the people would celebrate their bounty. For many, this season marked the peak of the year, both in terms of agricultural productivity and social gatherings. Festivities were held to honor the gods and the land. In a way, this cycle of life mirrored the cycles of time. Just as the Nile flooded and receded, so too did the lives of those who depended on it. But even as the workday was dictated by the sun, there were moments in each of these seasons when time slowed down. Ancient Egyptian life was punctuated by the rhythms of daily rituals. Each home had its routines, rituals of offering to the gods, prayers at dawn, and perhaps a little time in the evening to sit and reflect. It's in these quiet moments that the ancient Egyptians found their own way of marking time, a rhythm that was slow, deliberate, and intimately tied to the world around them. It's fascinating, really. The Egyptians didn't have clocks, and yet, their lives were shaped by time in ways we might not always notice. Even the seemingly mundane acts, offering incense to the gods, setting aside time for quiet reflection at sunset, were forms of timekeeping. And in the stillness of the night, with only the sound of the river to keep you company, you realize just how deeply embedded this idea of time is in all human experience. Historians still argue whether these daily rituals were more about honoring the gods or simply about finding a sense of peace in an ever-changing world. It's likely that the truth lies somewhere in between. The Egyptians understood time as a force to be respected, but also as something that could bring about peace, clarity, and connection with the divine. As you walk back along the river's edge, the moonlight now soft and silver, you reflect on the workday that would have unfolded just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The world was slowly winding down, but for the Egyptians, it was far from over. Time didn't end with the setting sun, it was simply another part of the cycle, moving seamlessly into the stillness of night. And so, time continued, quietly, unobtrusively, in sync with the flow of the Nile, in harmony with the lives of the people who relied on it. Perhaps you'll find it in your own life, too. The way time flows in moments rather than minutes, in cycles rather than seconds. Just as the Egyptians did, you may find that, when you learn to live in rhythm with the world around you, you'll discover a more peaceful, balanced way of measuring the passing days. As the night deepens, the stillness of the air seems to settle around you, drawing you even closer to the natural world that the Egyptians knew so well. You can hear the occasional ripple of water as it brushes against the riverbank. But beyond that, there's an almost palpable quiet. It's a reminder of just how different the world must have felt in ancient times, before the constant hum of modern life drowned out the subtle sounds of nature. Your thoughts drift once again to the Egyptians and their relationship with the concept of time. With all the sophistication of their civilization, from the mighty pyramids to the intricate system of writing, it's easy to overlook just how connected they were to the land and the rhythms of the earth. Time wasn't just a number for them. It wasn't something to be counted in minutes or hours. Instead, it was something they felt, something measured by the sun's path, by the cycles of the moon, and by the rise and fall of the Nile. It's here, in the night's cool air, that you recall another aspect of their timekeeping, the role of the sundial. While we often think of ancient clocks as being a Western invention, the Egyptians were some of the first to experiment with devices designed to measure time. They didn't have the mechanical clocks we know today, but they understood that the sun's position in the sky could be used to mark time throughout the day. The Egyptians devised simple sundials, which used the shadow cast by a stick placed in the ground to indicate the time. Historians still debate how accurately the Egyptians could measure time using these sundials. After all, their calendars were more attuned to the cycles of the moon and the flooding of the Nile than the strict divisions of hours and minutes that we now take for granted. Some scholars argue that these sundials were used primarily for ceremonial purposes, marking the times for religious observances and rituals. But others believe they had a more practical application as well, helping people to structure their workdays in a way that was aligned with the natural flow of the world around them. The sundials may have been simple, but they reflect a broader Egyptian worldview. Time wasn't something to be conquered or controlled. It was a natural force, like the river, that could guide the rhythms of life. In fact, as you stand on the banks of the Nile, you imagine how the Egyptians might have viewed these devices. To them, the sundial wouldn't have been just an object of measurement. It would have been a reminder that time itself is a product of nature. It's fluid, shifting, and shaped by the heavens, a natural rhythm that moves just like the waters of the Nile. And yet, these sundials weren't the only means by which the Egyptians marked the passage of time. You recall the ancient Egyptians' love for astronomy, another important tool in their timekeeping practices. With their sharp observational skills, they studied the stars, mapping out the night sky and noticing how the patterns of stars shifted over time. They had a particular reverence for the star Sopdet, which they believed marked the start of the annual flood of the Nile. Each year, when Sopdet rose in the night sky just before dawn, it was seen as a divine signal that the inundation would soon begin. The Egyptians used this star to measure the passage of time in ways that were more cosmic than practical, but still significant. The appearance of Sopdet wasn't something they could predict with precision as we might today, but its rising marked the beginning of the most important season in Egypt's agricultural year. The alignment of the stars, much like the cycles of the Nile, gave structure to life. Time was governed by celestial rhythms, which, in turn, governed everything from farming to religion. This reliance on celestial cycles and natural rhythms reminds you of how deeply ingrained the concept of time was in ancient Egyptian society. It wasn't just a measurement of the passing hours, but an interconnected system that tied the physical world to the spiritual. The Egyptians didn't simply measure time to track it, they used it as a way to connect to the divine, to align their lives with the patterns of the cosmos. It wasn't about counting minutes, it was about living in harmony with the world and the heavens above. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians saw the movements of the stars as more symbolic than practical. Did they view the rise of Sopdet and the other celestial events as mere guides to agricultural life, or did they believe these stars held divine significance? Perhaps, in the end, it didn't matter. For the Egyptians, the key was always about connection, whether to the earth, the river, or the sky. Time was something that bound them all together, shaping the ebb and flow of their lives, guiding them through the rituals, the seasons, and the years. As you stand on the edge of the Nile, you feel a deep sense of gratitude for these ancient people, who, without the technology we have today, were able to tune into the world in such a profound way. They didn't have clocks, they didn't have calendars the way we do now, but in their eyes, they had something far more powerful, a profound sense of harmony with time. They didn't try to bend it to their will. Instead, they embraced it, aligning their lives with its natural rhythms. It's a humbling thought, really. Time, for them, was like the river. Something to be followed, something to be respected, but never to be controlled. And as the soft breeze rustles through the trees, you can't help but feel the same way. Maybe time isn't something we need to measure with precision. Maybe it's just a part of the world we need to feel, just as the Egyptians once did. As the hours tick by, the gentle flow of the Nile seems to echo the passage of time itself. There's a rhythm here that matches the one in your chest, a pulse that makes you feel connected to something ancient, something unbroken. You can almost hear the soft murmurs of long-forgotten conversations, the rustling of papyrus scrolls, and the call of distant birds returning to their nests. It's as if the very air is alive with echoes of a past you can't quite touch, but still feel within your bones. Now, with the night deep around you, the stars above twinkling in patterns you can't quite make out, you feel drawn to another aspect of the Egyptians' unique relationship with time. What about their daily routines? What did an ordinary Egyptian do to mark the hours of the day? Was it simply the flow of the seasons that guided their actions, or were there more intricate, unseen forces at play? Here's where it gets interesting. Despite the grandiosity of Egypt's pharaohs and priests, and their awe-inspiring monuments, most of the population lived far simpler lives. These were the workers, the farmers, the artisans, the heart of Egypt's economic and social life. And for these people, time wasn't just something that happened, it was something to be lived in rhythm with. You can almost picture them now, walking the dusty paths from their homes to the fields, baskets in hand, ready to begin their day's labor as the sun creeps higher in the sky. It's often easy to forget that time in ancient Egypt wasn't marked by clocks or mechanical watches, but by a daily cycle of tasks that were dictated by necessity. Take the early morning, for example. For many Egyptians, especially those living in the countryside, the start of the day was marked not by the rising sun, but by the sound of water being drawn from wells and the bustling of markets opening. The early hours were filled with preparation, grinding grain, tending to animals, and preparing the food that would sustain them through the day. And for the workers on large estates or in the fields, the first sounds of activity would likely have come from the overseers, reminding them that the day's labor had begun. Historians often argue whether daily routines in ancient Egypt were strictly regulated by the seasons and the annual flooding of the Nile, or if the rhythm of life was more flexible. There's evidence suggesting that for many Egyptians, the seasons truly did determine the ebb and flow of daily life. The inundation season, for example, might have led to a slower pace of work, as the fields lay underwater. But during the harvest season, when crops needed to be gathered, it was all hands on deck. You can imagine the sense of urgency that would have gripped those who worked the land during these times. There was no real off-season for many of these laborers, and yet, despite the hustle, there must have been a profound sense of connectedness to the land. But beyond the agricultural cycles, time also manifested in other more personal ways. Take the concept of the workday itself. Unlike the structured hours we use today, an ancient Egyptian workday would have been measured by tasks, not by clocked hours. Imagine yourself standing in the middle of an ancient Egyptian village or town, seeing the world through their eyes. Instead of focusing on the hours ticking away, you'd focus on the task at hand, finishing your work before the sun set. The movement of time was embedded in the work itself. Still, the Egyptians weren't immune to a need for structure, and their way of keeping time had a way of ensuring productivity. Water clocks were among the earliest known devices to measure time in a more structured fashion. Water clocks weren't common everywhere in Egypt, but they played a role in larger, more centralized cities. In these places, priests and officials would use these devices to track time during religious ceremonies or other important rituals. The concept of time was being organized into intervals for the first time, and even in these intervals, there was a strong sense of connection to the natural world. The Egyptians didn't just use water clocks to mark hours, they were more like tools that helped the priests measure sacred moments, moments when they connected most deeply with the divine. But what about the nighttime hours? When the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to dot the sky, the Egyptians didn't simply close their eyes and forget about time. Nighttime rituals were just as important as those performed during the day. The Egyptians worshipped a number of gods related to the night, including the god Khonsu, the lunar god, whose influence was thought to govern the movements of the stars. The appearance of the moon in the night sky was just as important as the appearance of the sun in the day, and many Egyptians viewed the night as a sacred time, a time when they could connect with the divine in ways that were different from their daily lives. Historians still argue whether Egyptians actually had a specific bedtime, or if their rhythms of life were simply determined by natural factors. Did they live their lives based on the natural ebb and flow of the world, or was there a more structured approach to the day and night cycle? We can only guess at the details, but it's likely that, just like their understanding of time itself, the Egyptians viewed the night as another part of a greater cycle, one that brought balance to the natural world. As you stand here, on the bank of the Nile with the cool night air swirling around you, you begin to feel the pull of time in ways that are different from the ticking of a modern clock. The Egyptians, too, lived by a time that was about balance, about aligning their lives with the rhythms of the universe. In the same way, you feel the weight of time not in its measurement, but in the feeling of connectedness it brings. Perhaps the most profound lesson the Egyptians can teach us about time is this: it's not about how quickly we move, but how we move in harmony with the world. As the ancient Egyptians found peace by following the cycles of the Nile and the stars, so too can we find balance in our own lives, letting time become a guide rather than a burden. By now, you're settling deeper into the calm rhythm of this journey through ancient Egypt. As you lean back, the steady movement of the river beneath you seems to match the flow of thoughts in your mind, slowly and peacefully. You begin to imagine what it would have been like to live in a world where the very measurement of time was so intricately linked to the earth beneath your feet. The Egyptians didn't just see time as something to mark, they viewed it as an entity to be respected, an entity that could not be hurried, only honored. Let's consider the wider context of Egypt's interaction with the outside world and how time was viewed in foreign lands. Trade was vital to Egypt's economy, and with the flow of goods came the flow of ideas. For example, Egypt's relationship with the Mesopotamians, who were also pioneering their own ways of tracking time, may have influenced the Egyptian system. The Sumerians, for instance, were the first to divide the day into 12 hours, a concept that Egyptians also adopted. Yet, despite these external influences, Egypt maintained a distinctly local flavor in how it treated time, a flavor that remained deeply tied to its agricultural cycles and religious practices. You may wonder, why was the number 12 so significant? The Sumerians, for reasons that historians still debate, based their timekeeping on the sexagesimal system, which is rooted in the number 60. The Egyptians, however, preferred the more natural duodecimal system, 12, which they saw as a more harmonious fit with their experience of the day and night. This preference is apparent in the division of the day into 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of night. But interestingly, while many cultures followed the Egyptians in using this system, Egypt's approach was far more intertwined with the natural world. When you picture an ancient Egyptian village at night, the moon rising high over the horizon, and the stillness of the land, it's hard not to imagine that the moonlit hours had a special significance. Egyptian timekeepers, or rather, those who kept time for the gods, would have been awake during the night, using the light of the moon and stars to track the passage of time. Their connection to the heavens wasn't just about tracking hours. It was about understanding the larger cosmic order that governed everything from the flooding of the Nile to the very construction of the Great Pyramids. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians were more concerned with the solar year, the year marked by the sun's annual cycle, or whether they saw time in the context of the lunar cycle, which had a strong presence in their calendar. Some scholars suggest the Egyptians, by relying on the star Sirius to mark the start of their year, were more connected to the cosmic rhythms that dictated both farming cycles and religious ceremonies. Others think the connection to the moon and its phases was just as critical, as it determined everything from harvests to festivals. What is truly fascinating, though, is how the Egyptians' grasp of time wasn't just practical, it was spiritual. Time for them wasn't just about the measurement of the seconds, minutes, and hours, it was about aligning themselves with the divine order. Every passing moment, whether spent harvesting grain or offering prayers at a temple, was an opportunity to honor the gods and ensure harmony between the earthly realm and the divine. If you imagine walking through one of Egypt's ancient temples, you might picture the towering columns and the beautiful carvings that adorn the walls. These murals, though intricate, aren't just works of art, they also tell the story of time itself. Every image, every symbol, represents a moment in the cosmic calendar, a moment that the Egyptians believed connected them to the gods and to the forces of nature. You can almost feel the weight of these moments as you wander through time in the dim light, each step echoing the importance of every hour and every cycle. What's even more surprising is that timekeeping devices, like the water clocks, were not just practical tools, they were often ritual objects. They were sacred, built to ensure that the passage of time was marked in the most precise way possible, to honor not only daily life but the gods themselves. Some priests might have used a water clock to measure time during important rituals, timing their offerings or prayers with a level of precision that seems almost divine in its care. This wasn't just a tool to manage the day, it was a sacred instrument of alignment, a way to honor the gods by marking each moment in perfect accordance with the heavens. But not all Egyptians, especially those living in rural areas, would have had access to such devices. For them, timekeeping was simpler and more tied to nature. They measured their days in the movement of the sun, the flooding of the Nile, and the phases of the moon. It's almost poetic, isn't it? That time, for these Egyptians, was not a device to control life but a reflection of its flow, a mirror of the universe's greater movement. Historians still argue whether there was a central, unified Egyptian calendar at first. Some believe that each city or region might have had its own timekeeping system, marked by local celestial observations. Over time, these local systems likely merged into the more unified Egyptian system we recognize today. But no matter the details of that early period, one thing is clear. The Egyptians had a profound respect for time's role in shaping their lives, and this respect extended far beyond the hours of the day. As the night deepens around you, the moon overhead continues its steady arc across the sky. You feel a quiet connection to the Egyptians, to their sense of time as something vast and eternal. Perhaps that's one of the greatest legacies of their culture. The realization that time is not something to conquer, but something to flow with, something to live in rhythm with. As the hours drift by and the soft glow of the moon grows gentler, we find ourselves at the final stage of our journey through ancient Egypt's masterful grasp on time. You might feel as though the passage of time itself has slowed, with each breath syncing with the gentle rhythm of the world around you. This, perhaps, is the greatest gift the ancient Egyptians gave us, a reminder that time is not an enemy to fight against, but a force to be respected and gently navigated. We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? From the ancient use of sundials to the way time was intertwined with the Egyptians' religious practices, we've learned that every aspect of Egyptian life was calibrated in accordance with the movements of the sun, moon, and stars. But there's one final, lingering question that still deserves a moment of our attention. How did the Egyptians' innovations in timekeeping affect the world that came after them? The truth is, Egypt's advancements in timekeeping didn't just stay confined to the sands of the Nile. They echoed through history, eventually influencing cultures far beyond Egypt's borders. Let's travel forward in time just a little bit to see the ripple effect. As the Egyptians' ideas filtered into Greece and Rome, they reshaped the way people thought about hours and minutes. The Roman Empire, for instance, adopted Egyptian-style timekeeping, incorporating water clocks and other tools to track time in their vast territories. It was these innovations that helped define the structure of Roman daily life, giving them a sense of order in their sprawling empire. And of course, the Romans went on to pass these concepts down through the ages, eventually influencing the way we measure time today. However, the Egyptians' influence wasn't confined to the West. Their systems of timekeeping also made their way into Arabia and later into the Islamic world. In fact, Arab scholars in the Middle Ages were so inspired by Egyptian timekeeping methods that they refined them, using astronomical observations to create even more accurate calendars and clocks. These scholars played a key role in preserving and passing on ancient knowledge during Europe's medieval period, making sure that the Egyptians' wisdom was not lost. So, even today, if you glance at the clock on your wall or tap the watch on your wrist, it's a small but profound reminder that time, much like the rivers of Egypt, is both unyielding and ever-flowing. The ancient Egyptians' careful tracking of time, whether through simple sundials or the grandiose movements of the stars, laid the groundwork for everything we use today. It's a subtle connection, one that links us directly to those who once gazed at the stars under the desert sky, measuring the cycles of the universe with the same quiet reverence we might feel in this very moment. Now, as we start to bring this journey to a close, take a moment to consider what time means to you. It's easy, in the rush of modern life, to feel as though time is something that slips through your fingers, something we are always trying to catch up with. But tonight, as we've explored the methods and rituals of ancient Egypt, you might start to see time a little differently. Not as something to conquer, but as something to live in harmony with. Just like the Egyptians did, we too can learn to sync our lives with the rhythms of the world around us, rather than trying to push against the flow. Take a deep breath, and let the sense of timelessness linger with you. The gentle passage of time, as measured by the sun, moon, and stars, continues to hum quietly around you, just as it did for the Egyptians, just as it will continue to do for eons to come. Whether you're drifting off to sleep or going about your day, time is always there, waiting to be respected and gently embraced. And as the night stretches on, think of how those ancient Egyptians, with their temples, their intricate calendars, and their divine connection to the cosmos, would be content knowing that their legacy lives on. You, here in this peaceful moment, are a part of that story now too, just as every whisper of wind, every rustle of leaves, every quiet movement of stars in the night sky carries forward the essence of Egypt's timeless presence. So as you begin to drift toward sleep, let your thoughts of the ancient world settle into a peaceful rhythm. Imagine the priests in their temples, the farmers in their fields, and the timekeepers marking the passage of hours in a way that felt at once ancient and eternal. As your breath deepens and your body relaxes, know that time, though ever present, doesn't need to rush. It can be, just like this moment, gently flowing and calm.